The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Glad to have you all here. We have a special guest tonight, but first I'd like to remind everyone this is a live call-in show, so you're free to call in, and you're encouraged to call in 343-9927, 343-9927. And tonight we have yet another special guest, WHYR's own Dave Brown. Dave, tell us about your show real quickly. Just the name of it.
My show is called Third Place.
Okay, Third Place. Yeah, so it's another news show. That's right. Another informative show that comes from WHYR.org. Lang Baker, good evening.
Hi, Wayne.
And, of course, getting back to Dave Brown, our special guest, he's the Baton Rouge representative of LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And, David, as you know, I was quite surprised when I did a search on their website to find out that you were their rep, and I didn't know it all this time. But tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm a Louisiana native, and I just want to say thanks first off for having me on your show. I've never been on this show before, and it's a real pleasure. I was born in New Orleans, and then my mom remarried and brought us up to Monroe, where I finished high school, and then went on to college in Mississippi and came back to LSU for grad school. And it was there that I co-founded organizations like CANOLA, that's an acronym for Cannabis Action Network of Louisiana, and another one called Students for Sensible Drug Policy, or SSDP, which was just a local chapter of an organization that existed on campuses throughout the country. And my first involvement with drug law reform was through an organization called the Texas Hemp Campaign when I was planning on going to graduate school in Austin, Texas at UT. And I decided not to do that. It was more expensive than LSU, and ended up moving back. So 96, THC, the Texas Hemp Campaign, and then 97, 98, I was back at LSU and helped form those organizations. And then after grad school, I went to law school in Vermont, and while I was there, I interned with the Marijuana Policy Project, and that was in 2003. And after I returned to Louisiana, I founded an organization called SIMPLE, which is an acronym for Sensible Marijuana Policy for Louisiana. And I've done work as a prosecutor in Louisiana, and that's how I got involved with LEAP, or Law Enforcement Against Prohibition.
That's what qualified you anyway, right?
That is right.
To be an actual member. Yes, so tell us, what is LEAP?
So LEAP is an organization which was founded back in 2002, and it's a nonprofit organization made up of current and former members of the law enforcement and criminal justice communities that are speaking out about the failures of our existing drug policies, and those failures are extensive. LEAP speakers are former police officers and DEA agents and judges and prosecutors like myself. And I worked for nearly 4 years as an assistant city prosecutor in Baton Rouge, though I want to point out it's important that I did not prosecute any drug cases. It's kind of an unspoken agreement that they did not require me to do that. I guess I would have just resigned.
They hired you knowing your feelings about it?
I think, some of them ended up knowing my feelings. I had the show, I had my radio show, and certainly did plenty of interviews on that, and many of my coworkers and colleagues were aware of the content of Third Place, but it was not something that we talked openly about it in court.
Okay. Well, no, of course not.
In the office. In the courthouse is what I meant. Excuse me.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, still, that's probably a good idea. But yeah, I would imagine a judge would frown on that sort of thing.
Oh yeah.
So we already know. Well, I guess you knew about the drug war already. But you were mainly focused on marijuana, though, during your early days.
That's true. I read a book by Jack Herrera called "The Emperor Wears No Clothes," and that was, I think, the start of the modern-day reform movement across the country, and that led to reading many, many, many more books. And as I was telling you before we started today, at one point I was able to say that I'd read all of the books that were written that I knew of at the time that had anything to do with the the U.S. war on drugs, which of course started during Nixon's administration and has cost us $1 trillion to prosecute and failed by any objective measure since then.
Yeah, I would suggest, too, and I think you'll agree in Lang, too, it hasn't been just a failure. It's been a huge crime against humanity, basically.
Absolutely.
Everywhere it's been implemented.
And it's disrupted communities at every level and broken up families and really disrupted whole cultures, and it's time to end.
Yes. Now, do you think it should just be marijuana that's legalized, or do you personally, and LEAP also, do they think that all drugs should be legalized and regulated?
So this is something of a nuanced response, and forgive me for that. I don't usually talk in these sort of political tones, but
right, you gotta be careful.
I wear multiple hats.
I understand.
And as a LEAP speaker, I am in favor of promoting the message that that the entire war on drugs against all currently illicit drugs is a problem, and that no one should be prosecuted whether they are using it medicinally or recreationally.
Okay, I appreciate that. And, of course, I have to agree. I think there are far more effective ways to deal with the problems, as Mexico was doing back when the drug war really got its initiation. Remember, we were talking before the show, one of the books you said you hadn't read yet on the drug war was by Johann Hari, I guess it is, Hari, called Chasing the Scream, and it's about a guy named Harry Anslinger, who you are familiar with, who was the secretary or the head of the old Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And he initiated the drug war in the United States and then pressured Mexico to do it. They had been providing, according to this book, had been providing the necessary drugs to the addicts just to keep them from committing crimes or they're hurting themselves or whatever, and presumably controlling them. And they were also trying to keep the cartels from developing. And Anslinger basically cut off all exports of America's opiates to Mexico and blackmailed them into, basically literally leaving their patients in pain so they would change their drug policy, and they did. And now they suffer worse than we do from the drug war.
Yes, the United States has been meddling in the affairs of Central and South America with respect to drug policy in particular, but in all aspects of foreign relations extensively. And nowhere have they done a worse job, arguably, than in drug policy. It's really, at its core, it should be less of a criminal justice issue and more of a public health issue. We're talking about medicines at some level or another, and if people are abusing those medicines, which they certainly do with pharmaceutical drugs, then the response, in my opinion, should be to treat that from a public health perspective rather than just locking them up and throwing away the key.
Yeah. That sounds like it makes a lot of sense to me. I'm wondering, LEAP is an international organization, is that right?
That's right.
So here in the United States, how large is its membership, and in Louisiana in particular?
In Louisiana, it may be around 1,000, though I'm not exactly certain of that number. I haven't checked in on that recently, but it's active in all 50 states and have, I should say there are members in all 50 states. And last time I checked, I was the only speaker the only registered speaker for LEAP between Texas and Florida. But there are certainly members that are paying contributions or dues or gifting to LEAP in all of the states. And we've just, as an organization, gone across the ponds into other nations in recent years. And so I really I don't know the answer. Actually, I wish I should know that, and I'll be looking it up and maybe can bounce back with that later on in the interview.
Has LEAP had? Oh, before I go on. I'd like to remind the listeners we're talking to Dave Brown, who is the local representative for Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, LEAP, a group of former and current law enforcement officials who are opposed to the drug war. You can call in 343-9927, 225-343-9927. So Dave Lang, have you seen anything on major accomplishments of LEAP? Have they achieved anything at all? Anything notable that you could say? I mean, I know they have a tough, uphill battle, but
Well, LEAP is involved in drug law reform anytime there's a ballot initiative, and LEAP is engaged in any state when they're changing their drug laws, and certainly in the medical marijuana field when you have a state like California recently. I mean, we had, I guess it was either 7 or 8 states ultimately that passed. I think there's a recount going on in one state now, but in each of those states, LEAP does, their education component, which is certainly a big part of all that LEAP does, and going out into various different professional organizations and making presentations wherever we can.
And apparently they had a part in the current elections where several states legalized recreational marijuana.
That's right. And so anytime that happens, LEAP is going to take a position on it and marshal, and organize their members to go out and do whatever it takes, whether it's, giving presentations or getting signatures or meeting with, other law enforcement officers or the opposition and trying to get them on board for
doing interviews with radio stations that do their best to put out what's really going on. Yeah,
sure.
Do you know if they have been engaged with members of the Louisiana legislature on these issues?
I do, but when that happens, it's typically through my position. So that happens again when we're sitting in committee and we're providing testimony in the House or Senate Health and Welfare Committees or Criminal Justice when we're discussing bills that are being considered that would address principally cannabis, but occasionally something like heroin usage. They will hear from me in my capacity as a LEAP speaker and a LEAP representative, but we have not in the last handful of years brought in anybody from LEAP National. It's just me, little old me.
Well, that for right now, just like a lot of other things in the world and in America, each of us has to do what we think is right and do it as much as possible, though. The drug war ostensibly was created to prevent the proliferation of drug use, but there have been many arguments and examples that crime of all kinds has increased as a result of the ban on drugs. Can you speak to that?
The idea that the war on drugs itself leads to increased crime rather than actually it has a
aside from the fact that they made one more thing illegal or something else, sort of obviously, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, this goes to the idea that, when the United States citizenry bought into the notion that there should be a war on drugs, and this was articulated first by the Nixon administration and then carried on by each successive administration after that. The idea was that there was a big problem and that we were having, this scourge and this outbreak of crime that was resulting from addicts, for example, that needed to get their fix on heroin or whatever that was. And the numbers from the start were always greatly exaggerated. I mean, and that dated back to, the yellow journalism.
Remember the Maine?
Yeah, sure, yeah. And Anslinger's time. But it really ignited under the Nixon administration. And, principally, and it's been written about a lot of times, and there's credible evidence that shows, and by that I mean like actual people that served in the administration and the journals that they kept and their calendars and who they were meeting with and all that, but also Nixon having commissioned a study on drug usage and then just throwing out the results when they didn't come back in his favor. I mean, it was really a strong and concerted misinformation campaign from the beginning, but it was just this idea that the crime rate was off the charts when it really wasn't, and that it was closely tied to drug usage. And so from the very start, there was this cultivation of fear and this manufacturing of consent, to borrow from Noam Chomsky's terminology.
I've used that before too, and credited him.
That we had this great big problem and that we needed to respond to it in kind. And so these budgets just really took off and skyrocketed. But what they weren't doing was spending money on treatment, and they weren't spending money in the ways that a similarly funded, well-oiled arm of government that's dealing with public health would have done it. And so, when you catch someone in the spiral, you're arresting someone for a drug-related charge, then really the most harm done was not in the usage of the drug itself, but in the incarceration of that individual, because you've broken up their family. Many times they're the breadwinners of those families, or their job was as contributing members of society. I mean, it's happened to public school teachers and people from all walks of life. And then those people come out, and then they're branded a felon, and so their opportunities are limited. And so one of the ways to answer the question that you asked is to explain that a lot of the reason behind that reality is that people are left with fewer choices for what they can do. And when you still just need to feed your family or feed yourself, then sometimes you end up committing crimes, or you end up associating with others that you knew from in prison. And it's just the recidivism fuels all of this, because people, once you're branded a criminal, have a hard time finding honest work.
Yes, I agree.
And then there's also the racial disparity and the impacts that you've just described.
So that's an important aspect of all of this, because one thing that we have learned through the years is that the relative amounts of usage in what are currently illicit or illegal drugs is the same from race to race. And so, for example, just to limit it to two in the discussion, if you have Caucasian and black drug users, then those people are consuming drugs in relatively equal proportions, but then you have built-in sentencing disparities, which are beginning to change through time, through, I guess, judges that speak out on it, or quit their jobs and resign in disgust, or
and become members of LEAP.
Or that, yeah, they do. Thankfully, some great ones have, or through the media and just education, we understand that there are built-in disparities and unfair provisions that would, for cocaine in different forms, for example, that's the most commonly known one, is that there was 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. And so if you were a person who was holding a gram of cocaine and in powder form, then at the time for sentencing in the courts, you on average would receive 1/100th of the amount of jail time as an individual who had a gram of cocaine, but it was in rock form, or what's commonly referred to as crack. So there's sentencing disparities built in there, but there are also racial disparities, because although both individuals in the or cohorts in the black population or the white population of drug users are using relatively the same amounts, they're using it in different forms. So, for example, the white people or the Caucasian would tend to have been using powdered cocaine more often than they would choose to use rock cocaine. So there was a built-in sentencing disparity there, but just also in the prosecution. So,
is it not also easier to go after people who are economically disadvantaged or down toward the lower rungs?
Well, I think that there are a lot of reasons for that as well, and we're not going to be able to cover it all in the short space of time in this show. But one of the things you can think about, for example, is that if you're a poor person, independent of color, oftentimes you're living, in assisted living or housing, public housing, and there's a zero tolerance policy there for drug usage. And so, since you can't use the drug inside, if you don't have a job and don't have any means for getting a job, and you're unemployable for whatever reason, perhaps you've had a run-in with the criminal justice system in the past, and you decide that you're going to get involved in the drug trade, maybe you have an addiction, who knows what, you're going to tend to do that outside, and that's part of the explanation for why you see more people of color who are involved in the drug trade or the black market doing that on street corners or out in the open rather than inside, because they can't do it inside.
Right, and they have less means to conceal it, like you're saying. I mean, prostitution, I think, is kind of the same way. Since we make it illegal, the more subtle, secretive means are not available to a lot of people.
Let me mention this, though, because the question came up earlier, and it's unrelated to where we're talking now, but it's 150,000 supporters for LEAP across the country, and that's including, like I said, police and judges and prosecutors and prison wardens and even FBI and DE agents.
Okay, well, thanks for that factoid or whatever. You mentioned some judges and retired law enforcement officials and others who kept themselves or were informed about the problems ahead of time are involved in LEAP. And we talked about the violence that might be related to it. Are there any parallels between the drug war and America's alcohol prohibition, era of alcohol prohibition? I mean, look at what we had there. We had gangs, we had drive-by shootings, we had entire neighborhoods terrorized, politicians threatened or... I mean, wasn't Elliot Ness and his Untouchables? They were cops that couldn't be touched, so to speak, by the underworld, who were corrupting a lot of our law enforcement.
That's right. And if you think about Al Capone's crime syndicate, and I guess it started in Chicago, as I recall, he was involved heavily in alcohol and bootlegging. And to answer your question, there are strong parallels, and they're diverse and legion, but some of the things that come to mind are that what you're addressing from a public policy perspective at its root is an individual, a human being's quest for altered states of consciousness, and we do that so many different ways. I mean, just something as basic and simple as chocolate is going to alter your chemistry,
caffeine,
ever so briefly, sure. And and these relationships with plants is where it all, at its core comes down to, have existed for much, much longer than, Western civilization. And it seems futile to me, and has proven to be extremely wasteful and costly in lives and public resources in every way to try and control that. And it's a system of control at its core. And, one thing that we know is, even in jails, you can find just about any drug you need to. Depends on which jail you're looking at. But I remember within the last handful of years, maybe the last 2 or 3 years, there was some video that came out from the Orleans Parish prison, which was showing even injecting heroin. I mean, there was drug usage there, and people were smoking cannabis in there. They had even guns. They had cell phones, and it just occurred to me somewhere along the line that if you can't even keep the target substance or item out of jails, then good luck in a free society keeping it out of homes where property protection of property is sacrosanct. It's futility, and it's insane, and I'm glad to see the insanity finally drawing to an end.
Yeah, unfortunately, it had to be partly because of the overcrowding of our prisons, the expenses related with that, and the crash of 2008 that pinched state budgets. That was the first time I think we saw states openly thinking about releasing nonviolent marijuana offenders.
In the year 2000?
Was it 2000?
No, I'm sorry. I missed that.
It was the crash of 2007, 2008, I think it was.
Okay, sure.
When the budgets were really, really strapped, they were hurting for money, and they had overflowing prisons. They were having to pay private companies to build new ones, and of course they were probably part of the lobbying effort to implement and enforce drug laws. So they finally said, well, maybe we should take another look at drug prohibition. That's
right, Wayne. And, it's one thing that's been rewarding and sort of a background level in my mind is just thinking that, through the years, what was conspiratorial or was thought to be conspiratorial, or people laughed you off and didn't take you seriously, has finally been uncovered. Thanks to muckraking journalists and authors of the book like you just referenced, and so many others. The truth is being uncovered, but it was buried so very deeply. I mean, we're looking at probably 70 years of prohibition, and the stigma that's attached as a result of that has been thick and hard to cut through.
The stigma is powerful, I agree. I've known people who, when they did indulge in marijuana as adults, mature adults, they felt guilty.
Sure.
And it was all because of the the stigma attached to it, like we're doing something wrong, you know.
I mean,
They're
the
doing
DARE
something wrong.
program got to us early in life in some formative years, right? You were taught that all drugs are equal, and you know, if you're using coffee, or if your parents are
Killer
smoking
weed,
a cigarette,
yeah.
or they just might as well be heroin addicts or
Yeah.
running lines of cocaine or PCP. You know, it's all just the same. And there's just been a lot of expensive misinformation and, you know, extensive and comprehensive at every level of government.
Oh, well, maybe I'm just older than you are, because when I was a kid, I don't recall that stuff. They were promoting coffee and all that other stuff and cigarettes on television and all that stuff all the time. There was no real big deal there. Of course, I just didn't hear it, you know. And we only had 3 TV networks, you know, sources of information and all that other stuff too.
I'm wondering what's on the horizon for Louisiana with a legislative session coming up in not too long in the future here, whether there are any bills in the hopper on this subject.
So each year at the Louisiana legislature, we have a handful of bills, and, you know, more or less we have 5 or 10 bills, something like that. And, you know, that's just specifically on cannabis alone, and in any given year you might have another small handful of bills that are addressing existing law, you know, typically making the penalties harder and harsher, but it's somewhere on that order of bills that are introduced each year. And then the now 28 states that have some form of comprehensive therapeutic cannabis system on the books, you would see much larger numbers, for example. So we're not seeing a large increase on the number of bills introduced yet. But if you consider that, you know, just 4 or 5 years ago, you would have seen either 1 or 2 or 0 bills proposed, then you've seen some progress there. And I suspect that, you know, it's going to be more than 20 bills that will be introduced in the 2017 session. And though that's just some measure of conjecture, because at this point we don't have access to any of those bills. There's not even a pre-filing period yet. But with respect to cannabis in particular, there will need to be many bills introduced to improve on the existing law for therapeutic cannabis or medical marijuana in our state, and they're going to take many different forms, but it's likely just going to target individual provisions of the existing law. And so rather than, you know, creating a whole entire new system in large, you know, 20 or 30 page bills that are being introduced, you may see 1 or 2 page bills that are better in the respect that they're probably at least going to be read by some much larger percentage of the legislators themselves. Because, gosh, if you get over 5 pages, sad to say, a lot of times legislators aren't even reading them, and so then it's really in the hands of the lobbyists to educate them. But
imagine that.
Yeah. So, but we're not. I can tell you this much: not on the near horizon. Nowhere on the near horizon are we going to see anything with respect to a full-scale, I'd say, Colorado and Washington model, where you have an adult use, or what is commonly referred to as a recreational market. It's just the only time I've seen that in the recent, last handful of years when reforms were underway was when Representative Dalton Honore introduced a bill, and it just didn't make it out of committee, and it's not taken seriously yet. So actually, even when you ask me a question about my position on drug law reform, theoretically, I am very much in favor of a paradigm shift and changing the whole legal landscape with respect to our existing drug laws in favor of a more, public health policy, guided perspective and laws over, just incarceration and criminal justice. I can tell you that with our organization called Sensible Marijuana Policy for Louisiana, or SIMPLE, we do not advocate for that sweeping of changes. We're not. That's not anywhere in the discussion, the lexicon, the language of our legislators.
No, and a lot of the people aren't either. I mean, it's going to take a lot of more education, unfortunately, because of the paucity of all kinds of important information out there. Are there anybody else? Are there any other voices active in Louisiana, and how can local people or how could people get involved with LEAP and help out locally?
Well, there is an organization that's very effective and active in New Orleans called Common Sense NOLA, which is worth mentioning in no small part because of their success at decriminalization on cannabis in Orleans Parish. When I first read the news about the changes there, I thought that it was a misprint. I thought that they were making it, by they I mean the city council, was making it legal for individuals to possess 2.5 ounces. It was actually 2.5 pounds.
Wow.
For personal use.
Is that still in effect?
That is still in effect.
No kidding. And
That's
nobody.